welcome to the very first episode of the News from Munsable podcast. And my first interviewee is Professor Laurence Hemming. So I need to give a little bit of an introduction to you, Laurence, because you're not a prominent public figure, and that's one of the reasons why I'm quite keen to do not just this interview, but a series of interviews with people who you don't see appearing as kind of talking heads in podcasts or in news media, but who nonetheless have very, very interesting and important things to say. And I can think of no better example of that category than you. Laurence, for the audience, is somebody who is never stuck for anything to say on any subject. But when he does say something, it's always worth listening to. He's genuinely one of the most insightful thinkers that I know of, really, who's kind of actively writing and working today. So I'll say a little bit about Laurence now for you. Laurence is the director of the Knapp Foundation, a fairly new research foundation that started last year, I think. Laurence, is that right?
2 years ago. We're in our second year, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you can say that a little bit more about the Knapp Foundation at the end. Would be good, maybe. He is an honorary professor at Lancaster University, having joined Lancaster in 2008. And prior to that, he held senior research positions at the University of London and at KU Leuven, which is in Belgium. And he has a doctorate from Cambridge, and he holds other degrees from Oxford. Among his published works are Heidegger's Atheism, Postmodernity's Transcending, and Heidegger and Marx, a productive dialogue over the language of humanism. With Bogdan Kosteya in 2017, he published a translation of Ernst Junger's 1932 The Worker. And with Aaron Turner, he's currently translating a volume of the later Heidegger's lectures on the Anaximander fragments. He's written and published widely in mainly German philosophy, but he's also edited and published numerous books, articles, and translations in theology, liturgy, politics, and classics. The audience will probably have gleaned from that introduction, Laurence, that you're almost certainly a Nazi and not to be trusted, given your your interest in the dreadful H word. Perhaps we'll discuss a little bit to do with Heidegger during the course of our conversation, but what I really wanted to talk to you about is a subject which is very apropos, I suppose, for our current moment here in the UK, and which will be naturally of great interest around the world, given it seems to be a year of big elections in the USA and France, as well as in the UK, and of course, obviously in India earlier in the year. And that subject is really democracy, what democracy means and where it comes from. And I suppose obliquely also what its future is. I always enjoy general elections because I always feel as though it's, I was going to say sacred, I mean, maybe that's putting it slightly too strongly, but it's a very, very important and significant moment, obviously, in a nation's life. And it's a moment at which I still feel, despite having become slightly more cynical as the years have gone by, that the exercise genuinely reconnects politics with the quote unquote people. And I'm always interested, or I've always observed, kind of looking back through the general elections that I've seen in the course of my life, that the people always choose, I think, the best option. In hindsight, when you look at the decision that's been made, it's usually the best one available. That doesn't mean that it's always a brilliant decision, because the options are not necessarily brilliant. But, and I think back, to the prime ministers who've been elected in general elections, the governments that have been elected in general elections over my lifetime. Generally speaking, you look back and think, yeah, I can see the right result was reached, given the options, given the choices. So people do, I think, I do have faith in the wisdom of crowds. I do think people, generally speaking, do choose the right option. naturally, you would rather that better options were available than the ones we currently have on the table. But I'm sure that the same will be true this time around as well, in that the people will choose the best option that is available to them. But it's inevitably observed nowadays that democracy is under threat or is being problematized. And I'll bring my comments to a close here, and maybe you can offer your own observations as to why that is. But on the one hand, the elite, as it were, the governing class, appear to be convinced that democracy is under threat from foreign agents, from mis/disinformation, and from this terrible kind of ugly populist impulse that's in the demos, which I've never really been able to get my head quite around. That, you know, in order to defend democracy, you need to be against populism. But there seems to be this real anxiety in the elite about the defense of democracy. But on the other hand, the people themselves feel as though they are increasingly disconnected from the elite. The elite don't really represent them, and that whoever they vote for is not really going to be representative of their interests. So from both sides, we've got this kind of undermining or rejection or dissatisfaction with democracy. So it seems like and that seems to be growing over time. Every single general election cycle, those problems seem to get worse. So yeah, so I thought that might be an interesting way of framing the discussion. And I wonder what you would have to say about that initial kind of observation that democracy seems to be under attack from all sides, as it were, from the people and the rulers.
David, thank you very much. I mean, thank you for that tremendous introduction. I think quite a lot of people in my life have thought that I'd say far too much and have far too little to say, but so it's great to think that you think the opposite, and I hope I can do justice to that introduction. And perhaps also to begin by saying that one of the things that I live right in the centre of London. In fact, I live in SW1, although I'm not part of the SW1 bubble, but a lot of the people around me are. One of the ways that I delight in slightly teasing them or taunting them is to open conversations on politics, because they all love to talk about politics, with the observation that I'm an absolutely and utterly convinced Democrat, but I'm not a liberal. And what I mean by that is that, like you, I do believe that faced with the options available to them, overwhelmingly, my experience has been, and certainly I would have said this since 2016 in this country, people have taken the best possible option. You know, people who are still saying, for instance, that the Brexit vote was very close are ignoring the fact that there was not one, but 5 effective plebiscites that discussed Brexit. And what became clearer and clearer was that although the initial result was close, what really made people most fed up was any attempt to change the initial result. The overwhelming majority of this people in this country, and that really does mean the overwhelming majority, reconciled themselves to the result of that initial vote and became infuriated. And I think what we are seeing in the current election that's going on in the UK now is their fury at the attempt to tamper with a democratic, what was in their view a democratic decision. And that's true. It doesn't matter what side of Brexit you were on, for or against. Nevertheless, the overwhelming majority of people in this country, it seems to me, wanted the decision itself respected, even if they then might want to argue that it be reversed or it be shored up. And that seems to me to be absolutely crucial. But that points us to something that you write about a lot in Unsible. And it's one of the reasons I read it, apart from the fact that you write very well and very enjoyably. And I'm giving you an unashamed plug. But that, I think you have important things to say in these areas, and you highlight things that are extremely important, especially in relation to law and what's come to be known as lawfare, or the conducting of politics by legal means, as it were. you've highlighted something, and that is to say that what I've called the Westminster bubble already. There is a governing class in this country who are not listening, or rather they are listening by refusing to listen. I think because I don't, in my experience, people are not stupid. So when they're doing something that looks stupid, they're actually doing the opposite of what they want you to think they're doing, and they're doing it quite deliberately. There is a studied refusal to listen, and that's an inversion of the very argument that's been used against the majority of the population in the last few years, which is that they're too stupid to make sensible decisions. I've found myself saying to students repeatedly who can't understand, for instance, why many women voted for Donald Trump, or why many people from ethnic minorities voted for Brexit, that nobody ever goes in to cast a vote, either in a plebiscite like the Brexit vote or in a general election, lightly. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily articulate about it. And that's one of the things that has been used against people, that because it's like, I was using this analogy to somebody yesterday, that we expect people to be fluently articulate about the things that they do, which is an unfair thing to do. If you ask the guy who won the winning goal how he did it as he walks off the soccer field in a particular game, he won't be able to tell you. He was lost in the moment, delivering the goal. He might reflect on it later. It might come to him. He might remember who passed the ball to him and in what way and what the formation was. But at the time, he was entirely focused in delivering the ball into the back of the net. That was his job, and he did it. He fulfilled it. And it's the same, I think, with a lot of people in the electorate. They have very, very highly cogent reasons for doing what they do. And actually, it's nobody's business to demand that they also be articulate about it in the terms that we would like them to be articulate. For instance, in the terms of, let's say, a clever second-year undergraduate studying politics at a major university in the UK. Why should people describe what they do in those terms? That one of the sacred aspects of the ballot box is that you do it in secret, and you don't have to reveal why you do what you do. But nobody, absolutely nobody, should presume that you do it lightly, because you don't. I don't know anybody who votes for a joke. Yeah. And if they do, they grow up, actually. And that's another point I make to the young who say, oh, I know somebody who voted for a joke. Well, yes, okay. But in 10 years' time, when they've got kids, when they're worried about the care of their parents, when they're worried about the education of their kids, when they're worried about putting a roof over their heads, it ceases to be a joke, and they won't vote lightly. Not that I do also think the overwhelming majority of the young vote, overwhelming, by the way, I mean 99.9999999% vote with great seriousness. Yeah. And if you begin there with a fundamental trust of the electorate, then you have a basis for understanding democracy. Now, to contrast that with what I said about liberalism, I mean, most people, when asked to define liberalism, start talking about the individual. But in fact, all forms of liberalism and almost every form of government that we've seen, from communism and ultra communism of the Khmer Rouge variety to fascism and ultra fascism of the Nazi variety, these are all forms of liberalism, because what liberalism does is it places the individual in relation to the state. And it's that relationship, it seems to me, which is agonized. So when we're asking about democracy, we're often asking about the state. And we're asking about something which has become separated out from us. Or in fact, perhaps I should put it the other way around. We have not yet found a way in which to involve the state in our everyday lives in such a way that it ceases to be separated out from us. Probably since the ancient Greeks. I mean, that's as you know, I spend an awful lot of my time with my head in Greek texts that most people have got bored with and left behind long ago, and that's of course, the Greek democracies didn't last very long, and they weren't all the same, and there were a great variety of them. But the one that we know most about, and the one that we think most about, is of course the democracy at Athens. So, but that relationship, yeah, go on. Yeah.
So can we interject then? So can you? I mean, I sense that you were kind of going to go in this direction anyway. But yeah, can we kind of lay out Athenian democracy? You know, people listening to this may have some idea of what Athenian democracy was like, but they may have no idea at all. So could you kind of a very kind of simple terms what that meant to when you said, for example, let's say we had Aristotle before us,
Yeah.
and we asked him, what does democracy mean? What would he say?
I don't like Aristotle very much. I always think Aristotle's he's one of those. I think there are two giants in the tradition in which I think and work that I both love and loathe, as it were. One is Aristotle, and the other is Hegel. They both had the mentality in my mind of schoolmasters. You know, they like everything to be super tidy. You know, Aristotle is a convinced logician. There's a logical explanation for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Hegel puts that on speed. Hegel's logic is not exactly Aristotle's, although it's derived from it in many ways. And so well, we can talk about some of the things that Aristotle said, but Aristotle is very often a pointer towards what else is being said in Greece at that time. The biggest problem that we have is that we understand democracy now through the individual. So, of course, you know, when we look back, I mean, a lot of people will say, well, of course, only men got the vote in Athens, so that's not real democracy. Well, that's true that only men got the vote, but on the other hand, we know from the comedies that were written, and we know from a lot of what was written at the time, that it would be foolish of us, at least, to say that women were not involved. And it would be foolish to say that women were marginalized. You know, we tend to read back into the past things that I think either we assume we understand, but or we just actually don't understand. Women had a powerful and lively life of their own in Athens, much of which has been hidden to us, except that the most recent research suggests that, for instance, a great number more people could read and write than we used to think. We used to think, oh, it's just classics is full of this language of the elites, modern sociological classification. Actually, an awful lot of people in the ancient world could read and write. They weren't cranking out tragedies or comedies or epics, as it. So the most important thing, I think, to understand about democracies that we don't understand about modern democracies is that they're aggregates of interest groups, not aggregates of individuals. And it's the relationship between interest groups, both in modern democracies and in ancient democracies, that allows us to understand them. So my great hero, as you know, is the figure of Solon. He's the person who, as it were, reformed Athenian law. Essentially, I mean, to cut a long story short, because I know we haven't got that long. As you said, I can talk the hind legs of a donkey, as it were. But Solon was invited to step in at a moment when everybody had become enslaved to the rich, either literally enslaved or indentured through through debts. And so, Athens.
Stop me if this is sounding familiar.
Yeah. So the Athenian economy essentially seized up, and Solon unseized it, and he unseized it by a simple act of he didn't do what, let's say, what Marx would have done, which is expropriated the rich. He simply cancelled all the debts. He simply unhooked everybody from everybody else. But he wasn't unhooking individuals from individuals. He was unhooking interest groups from interest groups. Now, we have some of what Solon himself said about this, and then we have other reports from much, much later. And so it's difficult to discern exactly what was going on. But two things need to be said. One is that Solon is always thinking in relation to tyranny. So the tyrant is that one who is to be opposed in the Greek mind. The democracy brings to light the polis. The word polis can mean city, or it can mean state, or it can mean the people. It's an odd word. it's actually related, and because I know a little bit about linguistics, but not enough to explain every move. It's related to the word pelein, which in Homer is a word. Homer uses this as a word to mean being itself, but it's also related to kuklein, which means to go around. And there's a crucial word in Latin which means the same thing, kio, or kieo, depending on how you pronounce it, which means to go around, from which we get kives. Kives is the citizens, as it were, and civitas is the city itself. These words, in other words, to swirl around and to be in a mass is the essence of democracy. And one of the reasons I don't like Aristotle is because we have derived from Aristotle the idea that the purpose of a democracy is to make everyone happy. It's not. You know, Burke says that, and Burckhardt picked this up, and then Nietzsche picked it up from Burckhardt and Burke, that the Greeks, he said, weren't necessarily the happiest of peoples. The purpose of life is not to be happy. The purpose of life is to be fulfilled as a person, is to reach into what you are both most highly and most basely capable of, and understand it. Basely capable of in the hope, in the hope that we avoid it, and highly capable of, in terms of what we realize. But often when you're striving to do the greatest things, they don't make you happy. We've fooled ourselves into believing that it's kind of self-fulfillment, but it isn't.
Right. Well, that seems to be, I mean, I'm not a philosopher, so you'll kind of furrow your brow when I start talking about Plato, and you'll think it's all incredibly naive. But my reading of the Republic, anyway, is that's kind of that's kind of the point of the Republic, as I see it, is that the main thing is to get yourself ordered, right? If you can order yourself and you can understand where you are and you can ground yourself and you can kind of order yourself in a just way, then you are kind of achieving your ends, and from that, the Republic will then follow, right? It's politics doesn't rescue the people, you know, politics doesn't save the people. It's the other way around, right? Once people get themselves correctly ordered, then you'll get a better form of politics, or then you'll get a better form of political organization. That's always what I got out of the Republic, anyway. But that might be because of the way I've come at it as a kind of a naive reader of Plato. I don't know what your observations are about him as a kind of juxtaposition to Aristotle.
So the thing that's been bugging me for some years is kind of what comes before Plato. Is what and a little word comes to the fore before Plato that Plato also becomes fascinated with, and that the Republic is deeply involved in, and that word is aletheia, which we normally translate as truth. But it means disclosure, aletheia, to bring out. Lanthanomai is to hide or to place into darkness, or to hide from itself, most importantly. And aletheia means to bring out into the open. And there is a suggestion, by the way, that that's a false etymology. It's not. There's one person said it was a false etymology, and every single claim that it's a false etymology leads back to Paul Friedlander. But he was simply wrong. And if you look at modern dictionaries and the most ancient dictionaries, they all connect aletheia with lanthanomai, and with as an alpha privative. And I only say that just in case there are kind of there are a few people
philologists listening.
who get very worked up about this. It's incontrovertible. But there are lots of words for truth in Homer. There's also etymos, and then there is orthotis. So orthotis is correctness, and etymos, well, etymos has a very difficult etymology, but it seems to be a form of the word, Corny thought so, a form of the word to be. So what is also true. You know, it seems to be an old participle that may originally have been estumos, possibly. But this word, aletheia, comes to the fore. It takes precedence over all the others. And that swirling around, that constant deliberation, which is the life of the polis, that constant rubbing up against each other, not of individuals, but of different interest groups. That's why we ally ourselves with different interest groups. We now call it demographics, but all of this, you know, has always been present in human life, of sifting ourselves out into actually multiple groups that often overlap, or sometimes are in opposition to each other. One can find oneself pulled in two different directions by one set of people you associate with over here and another set. That constant rubbing around nevertheless lets something emerge, which I would suggest is the being of the polis itself. So the question is how the state, because we can also translate the word polis with the word state, how the state gets separated out from the totality of the people. If that's the question that I haven't got an answer. So I mean, but it's dogging me. It's bugging me a lot, because it bugged other people as well. It bugs Hegel. It bugs Rousseau. It bugs the political tradition in which we stand. Is how do we place the people in their own relationship to being a state? What founds a people? You know, for Rousseau, in the end, he calls it the general will, but he doesn't really. He says the general will is not the will of the all. The general will is what's best for the people. And you see exactly there how a phalanx of people can emerge who say, "Oh, we know what's best. We're the best trained people, and the best trained people will tell you what's best." Welcome to the SW1 bubble. Is the one thing that convinces all people who enter modern politics is they do know best for what to do with your money. That's the basic problem of taxation there in a nutshell.
Well, not just that though, right? It's also even so at a more fundamental level, even than your money. It's your thoughts and your beliefs and your every aspect of your character, right? You know, I'm thinking it because you're talking as you were talking about this this idea of the people kind of like circulating together and rubbing against one another, and something kind of emerging from that. It seems to me that the contemporary obsession with disinformation and misinformation it is very much an attempt to almost prevent that process from happening, right? It's kind of so and to give you a really concrete example of this, I was actually thinking of writing a Substack post about it, but I might just put a link to it in this interview. But do you know who Mariana Spring is? The audience might know who she is. She's like the BBC's misinformation kind of like head honcho. She's sort of like well, it's like a boondoggle basically. She's got an amazing job because she just basically kind of trolls people on TikTok and then writes BBC news articles about it and how it, the deep insights it gives into why nobody should be allowed to express themselves freely. But her most recent work has been she's been kind of trawling through TikTok. And she's been objecting to the fact that when you go through TikTok, you find people commenting on videos, urging people to vote reform. This can't be. She can't get her head around the fact that people might do such a thing, and so she's convinced that it's Russian bots, that are doing it. But she hasn't been able to find any evidence of this. But nonetheless, she very, very clear in her mind that that's what's going on. But she makes this very revealing comment in the article towards the end of it, where she basically says, we have a problem because political parties have a message that they want to get across to the electorate, but the electorate talk to one another, and people are interacting with one another in real life. And that's kind of that interferes with the message which the parties want to get across, as though that's what democracy is. Like democracy is you as the individual get the information that the parties want you to have, and on that basis you make your decision. But
so
only
the ballot paper is essentially a multiple choice
exactly,
question. You've just
as though but it's this idea that there's something illegitimate about the fact that people are interacting with one another, and in the way that you describe. They shouldn't be
Whereas
doing it.
in
How
fact,
dare they?
it has to be the essence of democracy. I mean, and
Mm,
so what is the opposite of truth, of aletheia, of
mm,
what comes to be what comes to be disclosed that you can really hang on to? There's a nice, really rough translation of a word that you can hang on to and rely on, is
mm.
opinion.
Yeah.
So all opinion depends on the truth. But bizarrely, the question we philosophers ask, or we should ask, but most philosophers are not asking these questions anymore, but I do, is what comes first? You've got all these opinions swirling around in front of you, and you've got to make sense of them. And so that means you have to think. And so how are you going to think? Now, if you're Aristotle, you use logic, which is why I want to push him out of the room, because logic sometimes helps you and sometimes doesn't. But actually, what helps you decide is what is most compelling. And often what is most compelling is what you cannot get away from, what you can't get around. It's the opposite of Descartes. Descartes says, take everything away from your head. Imagine in your head that you can't trust anything at all, and you're left with one thing that you can't not distrust, and that's the fact that you are. And you can't get around that, he says. But the trouble is that you're doing that in an empty room, because even the other things that are in that room, you can't trust them. But in this case, actually, what you can't get around is sometimes what you also aren't entirely comfortable living with. It's the thing you can't rub out. I mean, Aristotle does talk about this, by the way, but in a different place. It's the things that are dreadful. It's when your friend rings you up and says your other best friend is now in hospital with a mortal disease, and you the first words you say are those most un-Cartesian words: "I wish this could be other." No, it can't be. And that, as it were, is a good mark. It's a marker for the truth. It's only a marker for it. It's one way into the truth, if you like. So how do we sift this out? How do we sort it out? And one way, as it were, without going into a lot of technical detail, one way is to work out that which cannot be got around, i.e. that which is more than an opinion, because it cannot not be true. It cannot not hold, as it were. You can't get around it. That's what I think most of us do, and that's how most of us sift through it. Now, people don't trust anyone to sift through any longer. I'll give you a very small example. I read an article by a very well-known commentator recently on sex education. And she sees sex education entirely as the area of biology. So it's all about, what fits where and with whom and how often and when it's dangerous and when it's not dangerous. And biology tells you all of this. Well, yes, up to a point, except that, it's not, I mean, people do work this stuff out, and there's a bit of trial and error. It's called pubescence. We've all done it, been there, as it were. Our friends help us out, and then we work out who are not our friends, because they don't help us very much. We make mistakes, we embarrass ourselves, and so forth. What people really need to know, however, in all of this, even in questions like disease and questions like contraception, is how to relate to it. So if I were teaching sex education in schools, I wouldn't be doing it from, with putting condoms on bananas, or as it were, biology, but rather through stories that kids could relate to, that actually disclose how you do the working out, how you avoid the embarrassment, how you don't get yourself embarrassed twice, how you work out who is gaming you emotionally and who isn't, which situations are dangerous. It's called literature. And of course, teachers will say, well, they don't read. Well, they watch Netflix. So any good teacher should be able to make a list of what's on Amazon or Netflix or Disney. These stories all have a base, and you can have a discussion. Should the princess, should Sleeping Beauty have let the prince kiss her after all? I'm joking now, but where was the consent? But the point is that we've technicized these things so much that we've lost the capacity not to deliberate, because people are deliberating all the time. You walk into the street, they're all busy deliberating, and they do it quite well, actually. That's what I mean by trusting the demos. That's what you mean, trusting people vote. But rather trusting ourselves to know that they are deliberating. We think we're in the know, and we think we're clever. And yet we don't trust anyone. We don't trust anyone with the means to make these decisions for themselves. And more importantly of all, and that's that point I made earlier about nobody goes into the ballot box idly, trusting that when someone does, they've tried to think it through for themselves.
Yeah.
And that's, so all of this stuff about, you know, fact checking and so on, yes, there's an awful lot of willing idiocy out there at the moment. There are an awful lot of people allowing themselves to be pulled in every which way by opinion, but we are doing nothing to help them sift through what those opinions are. You know, for instance, one of my neighbors said to me recently that her son is not sleeping because he's terrified the world's going to burn down. You know, because he's been whipped up into a frenzy over climate change. Climate change may well be happening, and but she said, you know, what could she do about it? And I said, wait, but also teach him how to wait, because it isn't going to burn down. It's not going to burn down tomorrow or next week. So wait a week with him to see what changes, as it were. In other words, teach him the means of deliberation rather than look for a fact. Oh, look, here's a fact that proves the world isn't burning down. Well, as we all know, it's a speculation anyway. It's all conjecture. It's maybe very clever conjecture, but it's still conjecture.
It's so difficult though, isn't it? Because what you're describing is such a deep problem in the way that we approach everything, right? The heart of everything is the way that people are educated now, because as you rightly put it, you know, it's in one sense it's very technocratic or technical in that, you know, it's kind of, well, as you described, a sex education class, right? It boils everything down to the nuts and bolts. When actually what you want is a kind of properly embodied understanding of what the subject is really about. That can only really be gained from the kind of much richer perspective that would be offered by, you know, a more literary, let's say metaphorical kind of an approach. So on the one hand you've got that, but on the other hand you've got this very, very moralistic, like sort of authoritarian impulse to tell people, you know, this is what is true, right? And you can't deviate from it even slightly. And if you do, you're a vile, foul bigot, you know. And I've got two daughters who are, you know, very young. One of them's in primary school. One's going to start school in a year or two. And you know, I'm really surprised by the amount of, I mean, I call it propaganda is the best word for it. You know, that gets kind of like drilled into them, even from the very, very young age. You know, this idea that, you know, I would call myself fairly centrist on the issue of climate change. Like, I'm sure it's true that there is such a thing as man-made climate change, and we probably ought to do something about it. I just don't think we need to do anything, you know, really, really drastic and extreme. I think it's a solvable problem. But the teachers in school have instilled into the children this idea that, you know, there's something illegitimate about driving. You know, you should be walking or taking public transport. You know, you shouldn't be driving. You shouldn't be eating meat. You know, how about a plant-based diet? So my daughter's only 7, and she's already able to talk about plant-based diet as being this kind of ideal. You know. And so so you've got this weird combination, haven't you, of this kind of very, very, I call it almost kind of like a prosaic interest in fine detail and kind of technical solutions to problems. But on the other hand, you've got this really strict and kind of sometimes quite arbitrary moralizing that goes on. And so, but the long and short of all that is that people aren't really taught to think in a sensible way, are they? And if people aren't being taught to think in a sensible way, it becomes very, very hard for them to actually do that.
And yet they do, you know, yet they do. I mean, and that's what gives me enormous confidence. Let me give you an example. As you know, I'm very vexed about grade inflation in university. And if you look at the average grades at the moment, 80% of students who go to do an undergraduate degree will end up with either a first or a 2-1. So the students understand this as a basic contract. I've got a 4 in 5 chance of getting a decent enough grade to as it were, keep the door open for whatever I want to do next. 4 in 5 is a pretty good chance. So my colleagues who are teaching undergraduates all complain that they don't turn up to anything anymore. Well, I mean, partly because I think, you know, we've been forced to dumb teaching down. So it's not nearly as much fun to turn up. You won't get stretched as much because the administrators don't like it, because they put pressure on, they put pressure everywhere to take content out of courses. So there's no point in turning up, and you can still get that 4 in 5 chance whether you turn up. And I point out to my colleagues that the students are making by not turning up, even to things that are compulsory, but still having the expectation, in fact, the knowledge that you're going to be one of those 4 in 5, or the chance you've got a 4 in 5 chance of getting a decent grade, they're actually acting rationally. So they're deliberating perfectly. They're just not deliberating the way you want. And which is because you want them to deliberate morally. Oh, even though it's all being given to me on a plate, and even though it's not very difficult any longer, and even though I'm guaranteed a 4 in 5, an 80% chance of getting what I want, I should still turn up and sweat my brow and work really, really hard. Yeah, go on, get a life. I mean, you know, do you listen to yourself? Is this, I mean, how absurd that is.
Well, it goes back to Mariella Spring, doesn't it? It's this idea that everybody just ought to be like me. Fundamentally, you know, just there's something wrong. There's something just deeply sort of sinful about being different to me and having different
and
preferences.
you understand why the university lecturer takes this view, because he or she loves their subject. That's why else would you do it? It's so badly paid. The only reason you could possibly do it is because you actually like doing what you do. And so you care about it, and you want them to care about it as much as you do, except that they're not going to, because not many of us end up teaching in a university. Very few of us. Very few of us care about it in that way. So accept that basic difference and then focus on how they learn. I mean, that's one thing I will say. Having said I don't like Aristotle very much, but Aristotle is an acute observer of how he himself learns and how others learn with him. He learnt to watch himself learning in a way that we no longer do, because we believe all the crap that developmental psychologists ram into us about, you know, at this stage they should be doing this. That isn't how learning takes place, actually. It takes place. So accept that you're different as well to your students. And then, of course, we convert our anxieties into moral anxiety. And then we project the immorality of them not turning up when they should do onto them, except they are behaving rationally. Because I tell you, if I were, I mean, I'm not going to criticize my colleagues, their lectures, I'm sure, are terribly exciting, but let's say 1 or 2 of them, the lectures are no longer allowed to be all that exciting. And I'm not sure if I were a modern undergraduate, I would be rushing into the lecture hall every time, especially when I can download the slides from one of the internal websites anyway, and get everything I need off there. You know, what's the point? And also, let's not criticize the students too much, because nobody wants to go to university and spend all that money and then just sit around twiddling their thumbs for 3 years. But don't criticize them for acting rationally, because that's what they are doing. You know?
Right.
In other words, bring the same degree of deliberation that you want them to bring to you to them.
Well, it's the same thing, isn't it? That, well, I do think there's something, the mentality. So what I was describing earlier on about the anti-disinformation, misinformation kind of crowd is quite similar to the academic in that way, isn't it? In that it's this idea that that the person who's doing something different to you, or who thinks differently to you, has to be doing it because of a defect in their character. It can't be just because they have a different, well, just because they're a different person to you. It has to be, there has to be a moral aspect to it.
There has to be a moral, and also whether we refuse irony now on an industrial scale. And so I find myself saying to PhD students, you know, never mind whether or not what you're reading, whether what you're reading is right or wrong. But your real job as a research student is to work out why this person said what they said.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you've worked that out,
Mm-hmm.
then you can deliberate with it, even if it's offensive to you.
Yeah.
Even if it's grossly offensive to you, work it out. Work
Yeah.
out why it's there.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can all take moral views on everything if we want to. It makes for a it makes for a very unhappy life indeed. I mean, it makes but actually working out why your opponent is your opponent, and that your opponent, therefore, when you do that, you may discover that your opponent is a worthy opponent, or even more, that you have something to learn from your opponent.
Yeah. Well, it's very, that thing about irony, because I do think there's something, I mean, it's too easy to blame technology for everything, but I do think there is technology, well, communications technology's got a lot to blame for in that respect, hasn't it? Because I think the way that, so I've noticed this in particular with the way that young men tend to communicate with each other. So, teenage boys, I mean, you will know this, obviously. Half of the listeners to this, roughly half, will know what I'm talking about. Teenage boys never say anything to each other that's remotely serious, right? Everything is like couched in sarcasm and irony and piss taking, and it's couched in this something quite elaborate sometimes structure of sort of, you've got the truth and it's buried under, one level of irony, which is buried within another level of irony, which is buried in. And if you're, and it's quite hard for people who haven't been teenage boys, in particular, to penetrate that and understand what's really going on, and how ironic it is, and often how very, very clever it can be in that way, and nuanced. So boys will say to each other things on the internet that is completely tongue in cheek, and all of their friends know it's tongue in cheek. But which, if you're the outside observer seeing it in the abstract, you immediately jump to the conclusion that it's something horrendous and appalling and has to be stamped out. And that, I think, results from this way in which the internet has a way of kind of abstracting things from any sort of a context. Because you just get this chunk of text and you can kind of read into it almost whatever you want, because it isn't embodied in kind of a tone of voice or a gesture or a physical kind of environment. So that's a huge, that affects the way people think, I think, very drastically, right? And that's responsible for a lot of the misinformation, disinformation, a lot of the distrust actually of people themselves, and a lot of the moral anxiety comes from this failure to understand that a lot of the discourse is couched in irony, that isn't really necessarily observable to the outsider.
I mean, partly a lot of this is just much more visible than it ever was, because we can now see it. We can watch other people's Twitter feeds and other people's discourses unfold, and without realizing that we're watching something that we're, as you've very eloquently put, we're not really all that well equipped to understand. And yet any pedagogue who sees this and actually works out how to understand it could also work out how to teach the same kids Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Because that's how it works. That's also a discourse that requires a certain facility to get into. Well, that's your job as a teacher, to get them into it. And then once they get into it, they can enjoy it, because it is actually rather enjoyable, because a lot of it was good knockabout stuff that went on in a theatre just a couple of miles from this house 5 centuries ago. And it attracted large crowds, very ordinary people, so-called, people who didn't even have degrees. Can you imagine enjoying Shakespeare?
There's Hamlet, my goodness.
How did they cope? They could have. They must have.
They didn't get the Freudian elements of it, but that raises so all of this kind of raises another question that I think is important, though, which is that so we're all, I think we both have a roughly similar kind of a view on things, which is, generally speaking, if I can sort of simplify things, perhaps oversimplify things, just letting people get on with it is usually sufficient, right? People can get on with it if you just leave them to their own devices.
It's not so much letting them get on with it, but finding out how to help them get on with it. rather than boss them around.
Yeah, creating the
You know,
conditions in which they can get on with it. Yeah.
so we've now understood information as rules.
Yeah.
You know, this, you have to follow this information because, you know, I noticed this, you know, when I just go around the supermarket, the packets hector you now. This is one of your 5 a day. This is one of your 5 a day. You know, don't forget you've got to eat 5 a day. In other words, that's what that's really saying. Instead of saying this is a very healthy vegetable.
Yeah. So but the question then is, so that's a really good example actually of what I was kind of hoping to kind of drive at next, which is that Michael Oakeshott, who you know I'm a big fan of, his reading of Hobbes, and John Gray actually has written some interesting stuff on Hobbes that kind of draws on this sort of way of reading Hobbes, which a lot of people would say is not justified by actually reading the text of the Leviathan. But so the idea is that the state, so the legitimate reason for the state's existence is that it does that, right? It creates the conditions of stability in which people can get on with it. So it creates this kind of framework in which people can get on with things without the fear, for example, that, you know, a gang of robbers are going to break into the house and torture them and steal all their money, and, you know, etc., etc. And that's the reason, that's the legitimating kind of function for the state. But someone who is in favor of that kind of messaging on food packages would, I think, say, well, I'm just arguing for the same thing because all I'm saying is people should have information about something that they may not know about, which is the nutritional value of food that's in packages. So all I'm doing is I'm doing the Oakeshottian, Hobbesian, Leviathan thing. I am just creating the conditions in which people can make free choices. They're informed. They'll know how much sugar they're getting. They'll know it's bad for them. They will make the right decisions. I'm just creating the conditions in which they can get on with it. So it's a spectrum. So where can we? Are there any principles that can guide us and where we can draw the line between? So I think everybody would accept that there should be a criminal law, and that this one of the main reasons why the state should exist is to enforce the criminal law.
You asked something really, really important, and something that again has been bugging me for a long time. The essence, you see, the essence of the difference between truth and opinion it depends on language. And so we need those who decide, we need those who are governing us in whatever way to enter into dialogue with it. And those dialogues have to be honest. In other words, they have to tell us the truth. If the climate really is changing, they have truthfully to tell us that the climate is changing. But except, as you pointed out yourself, and this is why, you know, I'm as I put it recently, on the arrestable end of climate change deniability, not because I don't believe the climate is changing, but because I know that some of the things that are being used to convince me it's changing are not true. And that's the only reason why I have skepticism here. Many of our politicians have refused to enter into dialogue with us, and they are going to continue to refuse. Whoever gets elected in this country, or in fact in the United States, or in France, or even in India, they are all resorting to the same means of a refusal to enter into genuine debates with electorates because they don't trust them, they're too stupid, they don't really understand, they're not capable of, and so none of which, everything that we've been saying for the last half an hour or so has been to attack that idea. And so we have in this country something called the Nudge Unit, as you know, in number 10 Downing Street, which I'm sure the next incoming Prime Minister will not disband. He may rename it, or but I'm sure he'll expand it, which is supposed to coerce us, to push us in the right direction. And I find it deeply offensive. I mean, I've had this conversation with a cabinet minister in the current government who said, you know, was extolling the virtues of the Nudge Unit and how successful it was. And I said, we do not elect you to manipulate us, because what is to stop you? When do you know when not to manipulate us to vote for you, which is what we call either gerrymandering or pump priming, or there are lots of names for it. electing people who then know how to enter into genuine dialogues with us, such that we would still trust them even if they told us things we did not want to hear. There's a good definition of truth. I said earlier, truth is when you can't get round something, even when you don't want to know it. So when you are with somebody who you trust enough to tell you something which you didn't want to hear, and which they don't want to tell you, but they have the courage to do so, that kind of politician I can at least have a dispute with. Politician who's trying to nudge me, to manipulate me, to push me, which is why, yes, I mean, there is a defense that says, oh, we're just giving information by saying it's one of your 5 a day, but it's a lie. We know it's a lie. We know it's a lie because people are writing academic papers on it. They're writing internal memos on it, on how to increase sales through the use of those kinds of slogans, on how they can manipulate or increase or decrease the number of people going into hospitals. Again, in spurious research that's done on the basis of what information is given populations when they, or taxing the amount of sugar in drinks and so on. All of this is a nonsense. Now, if we have an informed conversation with people and they still decide to do it, they still put their hand into the flame, that I would suggest to you is freedom. It's not comfortable freedom. And if somebody is idiot enough to put their hand into the flame, they must be free to do so. But nevertheless, they have to be free to do so. Now, I'm not, an absolute sort of outraged, dyed-in-the-wool libertarian at all. I don't fall into that class of politics, although but I do think honestly, our leaders honestly entering into debate with us is one of the aspects and characters of how we diminish that gap between the state and the electorate. I haven't got the answer for how you collapse it. It was a problem for Rousseau. It was a problem for Hegel. It was a problem even for people like Kojève, although I dislike Kojève. Kojève was, I think, an arch manipulator. It was a problem, a fundamental feature of liberalism, which appears in every single form of it, including liberal democracy, is that the governing classes come to fear and detest the overwhelming majority of the electorate. It's absolutely written in to the way in which government is undertaken. And of course, from their point of view, it's always the electorate's fault for being insufficiently progressive, for being insufficiently manipulable, and so on. In fact, it's the other way around.
But it's very, I mean, I increasingly think, well, I'm increasingly less interested in kind of sort of, let's say, preferences or policy as a driver of, let's say, the political process, because it's very much like, it seems to me that, so I don't know if you know, there's a song, are you familiar with Jacques Brel?
Yes.
There's a song by Jacques Brel called Ces gens-là, which is basically sort of like those people. And it's a song where a guy is
that lot over there is essentially
he's sort of like the way the song sort of plays out. He's kind of like it's clear that he is from a let's say kind of like a lower middle class slash perhaps also working class kind of a background, and he's talking to somebody in a restaurant who is posher than him. And he's trying to ingratiate himself with this guy, and he's describing the poor people over there as being, they're all, they're filthy, and they speak badly, and they make a horrible noise when they're eating their soup and all this kind of thing. And he's casting all those aspersions on them. And all the time it keeps coming back to this refrain that those people, ces gens-là, they don't think, right? They don't think. That's the kind of constant like referral in the song. They don't think. Those people don't think. And at the root of it is this desire to differentiate yourself from the masses, isn't it? It's this desire to present yourself as being superior, because you have these deeper insights, or you have better education, or you're morally superior, you've got a better kind of moral intuition. And that seems to just motivate so much of what we see in contemporary politics. It's just this almost pharisaical kind of this desire to set yourself up as being just better than other people, like it's a crude way of putting it, but just I can see that very, you know, when you look at kind of left-wing progressivism, just seems to be that motive. You know, the more I look at it and the more I study it, the more familiar I am with it.
The epitome of this, as you will know,
behind it all.
Yeah, the epitome of this, as you will know, is John Stuart Mill, who's filled with this kind of progressive contempt for the recalcitrant masses. I mean, he loathed anything that didn't, as it were, move us forward in different ways.
Mm.
I mean, I've always look. I mean, you know, I'm not even a political scientist. I mean, I'm a philosopher who deals in very, very abstract ideas. So when I walk into a classroom, I know that I've got to get people's attention and carry them with me, with stuff that initially, at least, the overwhelming majority in that classroom are probably, even if they're PhD students, you know, even if it's a graduate seminar, not necessarily that interested in. And my job is to open up why these ideas matter and to bring them with me. And that's my task.
Mm.
And it costs to do this, to try to do it well. I'm not going to say I do it well. You'd have to ask the students who've been there whether I was any good at it, but I try at least. I was taught by somebody who could do it spectacularly. And I remember sitting in his classes thinking, this is how I want to teach.
Mm.
Because he took all of us with him into places that we never thought we would go. Day after day. I mean, he was a remarkable teacher, and if I can, but that, as it were, is the essence of the task, and he did it, and he did it, I think, by assuming a relationship not of superiority to those of us who he was teaching, but one of humility.
Mm.
That is to say, he was just desperate to give away everything he had, because that was the only way he could hold on to it. You know? And that has been my own goal. And as I said, I have no idea whether I've been any good at it. I certainly know when I've failed. And it's not easy. The political task is not easy. There isn't an answer. There isn't a fail-safe constitution or a fail-safe set of laws, or that swirling around, that kieo, that couplé, that pelein, pell-mell. That's where pell-mell comes from, the same verb, pelein, to fall over yourself and fall about whilst trying to stand upright. That is a genuine political life. It's not in the least bit easy. And why? What's the issue? The issue is not so that we can hang on to the past or so that we can fail to change, but rather so that we can withstand powerfully what is coming, because that's what we have to do. It's not, and that what we have to do is not, as it were, a task. It's just what unfolds. What cannot be got around is what's coming next.
Well, on that subject, we've got that's a great sort of I mean, we don't have a long time left, but so we could sort of bring things to a close on this point. But that seems to me to be the really worrying thing about the way that our politics has developed, because we seem to have got ourselves into a position where we're unable to respond, or let me put it another way, we've stopped talking about that issue that you just raised about how does the nation or the people orient itself, or a set of political arrangements, let's put it that way, the state, whatever you want to call it, a country, let's use that good old-fashioned English sounding word. How does a country orient itself and maintain itself across time as a kind of going concern, which is noticeably or kind of is observably like it always was, but yet seems to be progressing into the future and seems to have an ongoing kind of like indefinite life beyond itself, given the instability and the threats that face it. I think we probably had a greater sense of that in the past, because we faced actual threats, right? You know, kind of physical threats to the security of the nation that we haven't faced for a long time. So I think we sort of got out of the habit of thinking of the country as being something that we ought to try to preserve and have a stake in preserving and just keeping alive, right? Just keeping it going in the form that in a recognizable form. That seems to be something that we just don't politicians have ceased kind of talking about or caring about. But it's kind of the essence of politics in the way that you've described it. I think, how do you kind of muddle through, given that and stay alive in the face of what is out there, right? Of what is real, what can't be got around. Does that make sense to you?
No, it makes absolutely perfect sense. I mean, you're just asking me to write a 3-volume book instead of give you a soundbite. But it is exactly what I've been trying to think about. And so I'm going to give just a few pointers to how I'm trying to think about this. I mean, one of these things is to have an understanding of why the country is there in the first place. That's one of the reasons I've been reading Hegel recently. The only reason he can come up with that why a country is there is because it's an ethical unity. Well, that's rubbish. That has to be rubbish. It's there because it's there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I've been trying to get my head around the 19th century geographers, because they understood why human settlements, both on a small and a large scale, came to be. In other words, that's why the Rousseau's social contract is also a nonsense. You don't contract into a nation, you wake up inside one. And you wake up inside one, its reasons for being there are a complex interplay between its history and its geography. So that's the first thing. And I haven't got the answer. I mean, again, I have no answers here. I'm just telling you where I'm looking with my questions. Why is somewhere where it is? And if you want an example of how to think about that, read Halford Mackinder's explanation of why it's almost inevitable once in southern England the population reaches a certain saturation that a settlement will appear in the Thames Valley about where London is, because of its proximity to the sea, but its distance from it, its proximity to navigable water, but its shelteredness from it, the microclimate that's here. He writes in the most gripping way that it was inevitable a city would appear here. So that's a foundation and a ground that I understand. And then the history of this city, which is not one, as you know, but two. One is essentially a republic, the City of London. The other is the capital of a monarchy, the City of Westminster. And the interplay between these two, you can write the history of the empire out of that. Whether you like the history of the empire or not, whether you're pro-empire or against, or whether you're like me, you just acknowledge that it's a fact. It just happened. That's the way it played out. Being for or against it makes no difference to the way it happened. But the interplay between those two cities determined the history of this country. So that's the second. Have an understanding of history and geography, and geology and topology and so on. But then there is a third. This is a city of immigrants, and I've lived here most of my life. And it's a city of immigrants unusually. New York is a city of immigrants, but most people came in at the bottom. In London, people come in at every level, from oligarchs at the top to the very poorest at the bottom, and you can see them. What fascinates me about the 40 years that I've spent living in this city is that overwhelmingly the people I've known, many of them who've become close friends from almost every corner of the globe, have fallen in love with the country in which they've ended up in different ways. It doesn't mean to say they think it's perfect. Doesn't mean to say that they haven't got grumbles with it. Doesn't mean to say that they haven't experienced problems. I'm thinking of my friend Ijaz, who grew up in the Stockwell Park estate. On one level, a working class guy, on another level, a totally international person with connections in Kenya, with connections in the Indian subcontinent, with family in Canada, in the United States, and in Australia. So totally international, and yet technically, from a lot of people's point of view, at the bottom of society. And Ijaz thinks this country is great. He thinks it is worth living here. And he loves its institutions, and he's only one example of many friends I could quote. The people who, as it were, have brought themselves into a relationship with something that they found. That has been humbling for me, because many of our politicians seem embarrassed
Mm.
by what this country is, but I find many of the people who find their way here and want to be here and want to stay
Yeah.
have far more cogent reasons for doing so than some of the people who woke up here without really ever having had to ask themselves why or how they got there.
Yeah. Well, I think
Those are three areas that I would point to that could
yeah.
open up the questions that you
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to draw things to a close on that point. I mean, the only thing I just wanted to add to that is that I think that's I don't know if this is entirely true, because I think well, what I was going to say was I think part of the reason why Boris Johnson, despite all of his flaws, part of the reason why people responded to Boris and still respond to Boris. And I just lay my cards on the table. I'm not a massive fan of Boris Johnson by any means, but I'm just one of the reasons why he was so popular. I think was that people got the sense that deep down inside he loved the country. That sort of kind of came across that he, that he just seemed to, and it might be entirely fake. I'm willing to accept that might just be put on, but you kind of got that feeling that he did. There is in his bones he loved, well, Britain, but England in particular, and people do respond to that, right? And I think that we know that when it's not there. So yeah, I think there's definitely something to that final point you were making. But we could go on for ages, but I'm aware of that time is ticking away. So yeah, it's been great talking to you, and maybe we can arrange a future.
Well, David, thank you. I mean, as it's been somewhat scattergun, I said to you at the beginning that I felt like I was going into my PhD viva all over again.
We went.
And,
we didn't even cover. I think we covered the first bullet point on the list of bullet points that I came up with, but that doesn't matter because I think it was really interesting and kind of Well, I hope the audience will find it interesting. I'm sure they would have done. So yeah, it was great, and they also got a sense of once you wind Laurence up and get him going, but in a good way, in the nicest possible way. So thank you very much. It was great.
Well, thank you.
But I did want to also give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Knapp Foundation because that was promised at the start. So
yes,
is there anything? Would you like to just describe what the Knapp Foundation is in a couple of minutes and describe its mission?
A group of us founded the Knapp Foundation because a number of very talented individuals who were not getting absorbed into the mainstream university system, nevertheless, we thought would be a loss if they simply went into secondary teaching or some other kind of teaching. It's still in the process of trying to work out what it is. What surprises me, because I mean, you are part of it. I mean, you are, after all, one of our research.
Yeah, I should say I'm a fellow.
Declare your interest, as it were.
Yeah.
But although we have very disparate research interests, the approach that we've had to research is in each case been remarkably the same. In each case, we've looked for origins. We've looked at the sources of what interests us and tried to bring that to light. So I mean, in a nutshell, what are we trying to do? We've tried to peel away the technocratic processes that I think are gumming up a lot of research in the mainstream university, but we're not separate from the mainstream university. So all of us, I think, have got a foothold in one way or another in university institutions. And we're simply trying to keep the doors open for a certain kind of very open research. That's probably very vague. So what I would encourage you to do is just Google Knapp Foundation and you'll find our website. I haven't got used to answering this question yet, but Google Knapp Foundation and it will tell you what we're up to and who we are and why we think that what we're doing is important and is, I hope, an aid and a support to existing university research and a beacon for the future.
Yeah, great. Okay, brilliant. Well, that's a lovely way to finish things. So thanks very much to Professor Laurence Hemming. I'm getting more slick at this as the podcast goes on. It was lovely to talk to you. Yeah, and as I said, I'm sure the audience will have appreciated it. So great.
Thanks, David.